There is a moment in a US execution case when the abstract becomes scheduled. Not moral, not theoretical, not a court seminar with bad coffee and bright lights. Scheduled. Usually that means an execution warrant is active, the prison shifts into a special protocol, and the final day becomes tightly managed. Not every state does it the same way, and method matters, but the broad shape is familiar. Movement narrows, observation increases, checks multiply, and almost everyone involved starts working from a clock. In that last 24 hours, the condemned person is typically kept under close watch. Sometimes that means a designated holding cell near the execution chamber, sometimes a death watch area, sometimes just heavier restriction within an existing unit. Folks imagine cinematic chaos, secret tunnels, dramatic midnight surprises, all that gear. Nah. More often it's paperwork, escorts, controlled access, and a lot of people being very careful not to deviate from procedure. The state, when it does this, prefers clipboards to theater. Legal access usually remains available until the end, though exactly how and when depends on the jurisdiction and whatever emergency appeals are still alive. Lawyers may be in and out, courts can still receive last-minute filings, governors or pardon boards may still be petitioned, medical checks also tend to continue. That does not mean some grand, humane reset button appears at the 11th hour. It means prison staff and medical personnel, where required, confirm identity, condition, and readiness under the rules of that place. Some systems require explicit pre-execution assessments. Some are more narrowly administrative. If the records are thin, we should say so plainly. Who enters the orbit in that last day? Usually a fairly specific cast. Prison officials, obviously, correctional officers running security, the warden or equivalent command staff, lawyers for the condemned, clergy or spiritual advisors, though the extent of access has been litigated and can vary a fair bit. There may be approved family visits, again depending on the state and the prison's rules. The condemned person may also designate witnesses, often a small number. On the other side, victim witnesses may be invited under state law or policy. Then there are official witnesses, media witnesses in some US states, institutional witnesses in others, because even secrecy in America often likes an attendance sheet. And this is where myths pile up like old tires behind a shed. 1. Everyone gets the same final day. False. States differ, federal cases differ, methods differ. 2. The condemned can do more or less whatever they want in the final hours. Also false. Movement is restricted, property is controlled, contact is managed. 3. There is always one clean, settled protocol. I wish. Litigation over witnesses, spiritual advisors, drug protocols, timing, and access has shown just how unstable these procedures can be. Even when the state speaks with confidence, the fine print can wobble like a shopping trolley with one bad wheel. That final day is not just the end of a sentence, it is the system revealing what it values most: control, record keeping, and the appearance, sometimes the reality, sometimes just the appearance, of order. The public obsession tends to gather around three things: the last meal, the last words, and the little rituals that make the whole sequence feel almost liturgical. Not sacred, exactly. Administrative theater with spiritual overtones, maybe. A grim concierge desk where every request is logged, weighed, approved, trimmed, or denied. Let's start with the meal, because people always do. Contrary to the folklore, there is no universal American banquet rule. In some places, the condemned can request a meal within ordinary limits. Cost caps, local availability, no alcohol, nothing requiring unusual preparation. In some places, the so-called special last meal has been abolished entirely after public controversy, and the person simply receives the standard prison menu, or a modest substitution. Elsewhere, requests may be simplified, restricted, or denied if they're impractical. So, when you hear a very specific tale, lobster, steak, absurd desserts stacked to the ceiling, maybe it happened once, somewhere, under one old policy. It is not a national template. Procedures change, and sometimes they change because one request embarrassed a department into tightening the screws. The sequence around the final hours is also more structured than most people realize. Personal effects are inventoried and handled under prison rules. Final visits, if allowed, happen on a schedule. Spiritual rites may be offered or requested. In some jurisdictions, the presence and positioning of clergy near the execution itself has been the subject of serious legal dispute, so again, no blanket claims. Then come the mechanics: escorts, restraints, identity confirmation, movement to the chamber or designated space, witness placement behind glass or within a viewing area, depending on the method and facility. If the rules provide for a final statement, the condemned is usually given that opportunity after being secured and before the execution proceeds. Sometimes they speak, sometimes they decline, sometimes they use the moment for apology, religion, family, protest, or silence. Silence, by the way, has its own force. Quiet can fill a room faster than words. Why do these rituals exist? Partly because institutions need sequence. A state killing is built from authorizations, witness management, security plans, chain of custody habits, and a deep fear of procedural challenge. Ritual is administration, wearing a tie. But it is also symbolic. Last meal, last words, last visit. These mark the condemned as still, in some narrow and controlled sense, a person making choices at the edge of state power. Tiny choices, often heavily managed choices, but choices nonetheless. And that is why the culture cannot stop staring. These rituals compress law, morality, punishment, religion, bureaucracy, and performance into a single small window. They are intimate and institutional at once. That tension hooks people. It's like seeing a judge's robe hanging next to a set of prison keys. Two different stories pretending to be one neat thing. They aren't neat. Never were. If the US model often looks procedural, witnessed, and litigated to within an inch of its life, other countries can present a very different face in the final 24 hours. Same endpoint, wildly different philosophies. That is the real tell. Not just how a state executes, but how much it reveals, when it informs, who gets to watch, and whether the final day is treated as a legal process, a security operation, a moral ritual, or something deliberately hidden from view. Japan is the example people return to because the timing itself is part of the system. Prisoners there have been reported to receive notice on the day of execution, rather than well in advance. That compresses the final timeline in a way that is almost impossible to separate from the punishment itself. The condemned may not have the long, scheduled final day familiar from US reporting. Critics have long focused on the psychological burden of that uncertainty. Supporters of the system speak in terms of order and law. Either way, it is a different philosophy. Less public choreography, more institutional silence. Singapore is often described as tightly controlled and highly standardized. Access, timing, and communication are handled within a disciplined framework, and public detail is limited compared with the sprawling case-by-case spectacle that can emerge in the United States. That does not mean nothing is known. It means the state tends to present a narrower, more managed account. Clean edges, few loose threads. Very on-brand, you might say, if we were being impolite. And I usually am, just quietly. Then there are systems where transparency is much thinner. China is widely understood to be opaque in this area, with execution data and procedural detail often treated as state secrets or disclosed only selectively. That makes broad claims risky. We can say there is limited transparency, we should not pretend to know more than the evidence allows. Some Middle Eastern jurisdictions are also difficult to generalize about because legal systems, religious frameworks, and public reporting vary significantly. In some places, religious procedure may shape the final sequence more visibly. In others, the state's role is public, but the practical detail remains obscure. And in a few contexts, the line between legal ritual and public message can be uncomfortably thin. That really is the point of this whole tour through the last day. The final 24 hours are not just a countdown, they are a mirror. In the United States, you often see paperwork, witnesses, appeals, and the theater of due process. In Japan, secrecy and compressed notice. In Singapore, controlled order. In more opaque systems, absence itself becomes part of the story. A state will always tell you something about itself in how it handles the end. Whether it worships procedure, relies on silence, prefers spectacle, or hides the furniture and calls the room tidy. We'll leave it there for now. Next time, another doorway, another file, another look at what institutions do when they want power to seem ordinary.